just very quickly reintroduce myself. Thanks, Emma. As Emma mentioned, I'm a researcher at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge. I'm also an affiliated lecturer in computer science at Cambridge, and I primarily work at the intersection of critical design and AI ethics. My most recent work was actually focused on the ethics of human-AI interaction design, in particular when we're thinking about AI companions, including very specific cases such as grief bots or dead bots. So AI-enabled simulations of deceased individuals and potential risks related to such applications, as well as the need for new design standards and policy interventions that we can introduce to make sure that these technologies do not go in the wrong direction. But today I will be talking about a project that I have been a part of with my team. If you would like to learn a bit more about the team, please check out our website, desirableai.com, where this is a pretty big project between Cambridge and the University of Bonn in Germany, with this broad theme of rethinking AI for just and sustainable futures. So really everything in some sense. But I will today show you a bit more specifically how we were thinking about these big themes of social justice and environmental sustainability while thinking about reinterpreting or interpreting the AI Act, and how that relates to a practice-oriented project that Emma just mentioned. So just to very quickly go over what I'll be talking about today, I will give you a quick introduction to the AI Act. Then I will tell you a bit more about what tools are already available. So I will be talking about the AI ethics toolkits landscape, and Emma has done amazing work on this theme as well. So hopefully we will be able to have some conversation maybe later, or in general, we've discussed this with Emma multiple times. And then finally, I will show you how some of this slightly more critical theoretical work that I have done on the AI ethics toolkits landscape and on translating AI ethics theory into practice informed the approach that we took to designing the high-risk EU AI Act toolkit that has been recently released. So, okay, a very quickly short introduction to the AI Act. As some of you, I'm sure most of you will know, the AI Act is many parts of the AI Act. So the first comprehensive piece of regulation aiming to tackle some of the biggest issues and risks posed by AI comprehensively is partly in effect. Not all parts of the Act are in full effect now, but soon enough they will be. And the AI Act, as you will see if you don't know it too well, presents developers or providers of AI systems with multiple challenges because it puts together a list of requirements. But let's start maybe with some key definitions. I will skip the definition of what AI is. As you will see here from the slide, it's a very, very broad definition that the AI Act adopts. And we can debate which systems, in some sense, some of my colleagues actually argue that any piece of software right now would fall under this definition. But let's keep that aside for now. A more interesting definition for me is actually the distinction between providers and deployers of AI systems, and how these two roles relate to different responsibilities under the AI Act. So providers are essentially what we would normally call developers. Deployers are the kinds of entities that actually use AI systems in real life, but this does not this does not equate with end users. We can think, for instance, of a medical AI company provider that then sells its model to a deployer, for instance, a healthcare provider or a hospital. And then the end users might be nurses or doctors, but it is the hospital that functions as a deployer in this case. The AI Act is in many ways centered around the idea of fundamental rights and values in the EU, so a version of human rights essentially, and some vague concepts, important but vague concepts such as human dignity or the right to freedom of expression. And so the Act is trying to protect these fundamental rights and values And it actually includes, it makes it a requirement for providers of high-risk AI systems. I'll explain in a second what high-risk AI systems are. It makes it a requirement for deployers of AI systems to conduct a fundamental rights and values impact assessment. But today I will be talking about the role and the new requirements that the AI Act puts together for the providers of these systems, not the deployers. So very quickly, the risk-based classification system under the AI Act. So the Act distinguishes between systems that pose unacceptable risk, therefore they are prohibited under Article 5. So these, for instance, include some facial recognition technologies, not all of them, some forms of manipulation, AI-enabled manipulation of users, as well as other types of applications such as social scoring. If you're interested in which types of applications in more detail, it is Article 5 that you might want to take a look at. I will just very quickly note that some of these definitions are blurry and there are some loopholes. For instance, subliminal techniques and manipulation are not defined precisely enough to actually ensure that these techniques do not indeed manifest themselves in different use cases. And I will maybe skip this part. If you're interested in some of these loopholes, I can come back to this in the question round, but this is just to say, like, we won't be reading through the specific definitions right now, but I will just mention that while the article might officially prohibit some of these techniques, recitals that help make some of these articles a little more precise actually introduce these loopholes. So for instance, when it comes to manipulative techniques, what we learn is that in some contexts, such as in the context of medical treatment, including psychological treatment, these manipulative techniques are not fully prohibited as long as the provider carries out standard procedures, for instance, for eliciting explicit consent from users. So like a huge question mark here, whether this is the right approach, especially when you're thinking about cases such as AI companions that I mentioned earlier. But let's move on. The high risk area, which is in many ways the most interesting one because it is the providers of high risk artificial intelligence systems that need to meet all of these extra requirements. High-risk systems are essentially the kinds of systems that are deployed in one of the 8 areas that are mentioned by the Act as high-risk deployment areas. So these areas include biometrics, so some of biometrics practices are prohibited completely, some are permitted. If you're interested in this differentiation, you would have to look at Article 5 together with Article 6 and compare under which your system falls. But essentially, it's real-time biometrics that is prohibited by the Act. So the use of facial recognition technologies in the street, for instance, to identify protesters is prohibited in the EU, while it is allowed in the UK. Some other areas include the kind of AI that is used to manage critical infrastructure, AI used in education, AI used in employment, or workers management, access to self-employment. This includes recruitment, so the multiple HR systems that we now encounter when we apply for jobs that are AI powered, let's say, would fall under the high-risk category. And there are a few other categories that you can see here. What is important is that if your system falls under one of these categories, you need to do a number of things that providers of other systems do not have to do. So for instance, you need to go through a conformity assessment. So basically make sure that you actually do comply with the Act. You need to set up a very precise risk management system. I'll say a bit more about the risk management system in a second. You must also ensure that the deployers, so the second category, so coming back to the hospital example, it would be the hospital that needs to be informed about potential risks, dangers of using the system. This is the requirement for the provider to ensure that the deployer knows enough about the potential risk associated with the system so they can deploy it responsibly as well. And some human oversight mechanisms ensuring that essentially systems are built in a way that do not lead to situations where systems make decisions without human oversight. Just a few more words about the risk management system. Many companies already have such management systems, of course. But what is interesting here is that the risk management system includes the identification and analysis, as you can see here, of the known and reasonably foreseeable risks that the high-risk AI system can pose to the health, safety, or fundamental rights. So we look back to the idea of fundamental rights here, which means, for instance, that if you're producing something that might negatively impact human dignity, you need to think about what human dignity is. With the example of grief bots or dead bots, the example that I mentioned earlier, that one is this is a very good one where pretty abstract concepts such as human dignity actually help us meaningfully think about the rights of, for instance, deceased individuals that we rarely think about when we're thinking about the ethics of artificial intelligence. Anyway, I will come back to these specifics in a second of high-risk AI systems, because the tool that we built is indeed intended for providers of high-risk AI. But I'll just very quickly mention that there are two other categories: limited risk systems under Article 55. These actually, so most of chatbots, as well as systems that allow us to create deepfakes, are actually considered limited risk under the AI Act, which is a very interesting decision that we can discuss later if we have time. But in essence, providers of systems that fall under the limited risk category only need to ensure that the deployers or users of these systems are essentially forced to make clear that the content that is produced with an AI system is AI generated. Otherwise, providers also need to make sure that users are always aware of the fact that they're interacting with an AI system. So this is Article 52, outlining the transparency obligations for providers and users. And this is, I think, by the way, an interesting part of the Act, where it's not only up to the deployer, not only up to providers and developers of the system to ensure that, for instance, it's clearly communicated to whoever is interacting with the system or the outputs of the system, that the outputs are AI generated. It's also up to the users. This is the user's responsibility as well. Okay, so this was the first part of the talk, and I'll try to speed up because we don't have so much time, and there are two more parts. So the second part is really about the AI ethics toolkits landscape. I mean, I'm not sure if you know what you thought about the first part of the presentation, but really, it should make you feel like there's a lot to unpack for developers or deployers or providers. And thinking about these very abstract concepts, such as human dignity that I mentioned earlier, is actually very difficult for someone who is not trained as a philosopher or an AI ethicist. So, partly in response to this challenge or this dilemma of translating these pretty abstract concepts into practice, in the past couple of years, we have seen this huge emergence of new toolkits, guidelines, methods for translating theory of AI ethics into practice. The OECD catalog a few months ago, when I looked at it, comprised more than 800 such tools. I'm sure the number has grown since then. And these tools are very different. They're tools that are much more technical, for instance, helping providers or developers assess the quality of the data that they use to train a system. They might be more procedural, so for instance, helping developers develop a risk assessment system or a risk assessment methodology. They could also be more educational, for instance, explaining the difference between justice, equity, and equality. That actually is fundamental to understanding AI bias. So they can be a little more not all of them are necessarily very down to earth. Some of them are still more on the speculative educational end. As Emma will know, there are so many tools and toolkits that toolkit scoping has become a subgenre of AI ethics scholarship. So both of us are guilty of that as well. We engage in these huge reviews of what is available to understand what is still missing. And so in a paper that I published almost a year ago now, what I tried to do is actually get a sense of that landscape and understand what is still missing, what was wrong with what is available, or what is wrong with what is available, and then also think about how critical design methods that inform alternative types of toolkits can also maybe inform the way we think about mainstream AI ethics tools. So that's why in the title you see this range from big tech guidelines to feminist ideation cards, and I'll explain that in a second. But very quickly, when we're thinking about these mainstream tools, so for instance, the ones that are included in the OECD database, we can sort of see three types of issues that multiple papers point to when it comes to what is available. The first type of sort of issue with these tools is that in some sense, you could argue that they suffer from what I call in the paper foundational deficiencies. That is to say that when you look at what it is that they're translating into practice, these lists of values that they're supposed to translate into practice are themselves limited. So, for instance, they might skip values that many of us would consider important, such as, for instance, environmental sustainability. It's rarely, if ever, mentioned by any of these toolkits, guidelines, mechanisms. And of course, the number of tools that are aware of the issue of environmental sustainability is growing because the field of sustainable AI is growing. But this is a paper from 1 year ago, so it's a snapshot in time in some sense. The second category of critiques that these available tools are met with is that in many ways you could say that they are reductionist fundamentally because they reduce the idea of ethics into a box ticking exercise for engineers that kind of dissociates the difficulty of what ethical political life is from politics. So from collective mobilization, for instance, it presents ethics as something that can be done by a single person making the right decision using a checkbox, which ethics is not that. It cannot be that. And in some ways, it cannot be dissociated from politics. And when I say politics, I mean here essentially a fundamentally relational nature of ethics. That is to say that it's not something that is taken, in abstraction by a singular thinker. It emerges in our relationships with one another and with society at large. Anyway. And finally, and I think the most interesting part here for Emma, because she has been doing some amazing work on participation and participatory methods, is that many of these tools gesture towards the need for participation and inclusion. So some of them indeed refer to participatory or inclusive design methods as the kinds of methods that we should introduce to ensure that AI is developed responsibly or ethically. But they do not provide meaningful instructions on how this could be done in practice. So in some ways, some of these tools, you could argue, decontextualize these more critical concepts in ways that kind of make them devoid of any meaning in context. Okay, and very, very quickly, if you're interested, I'm in that paper. I also look at sort of more radical tools, and I try to identify what other tools are doing differently. So So yeah, because I'm aware of time, so I should speed up a little. So I'll just very quickly say that essentially you could say that when it comes to developing new AI ethics tools, we need to make sure that what we encourage is participation is justice. So not just ways in which we can extract insights from minoritized stakeholder groups, but actually we need to think about participation as a way to genuinely empower those marginalized stakeholder groups to actually participate and maybe even co-own the designs that they're thinking about as part of the process. Um, and when the other maybe element here that I'll point to is that when you look at these more radical tools, for instance, the intersectional AI toolkit, which I'm not mentioning here in the presentation, but I encourage you to look at it, is the idea that surfacing friction between what different stakeholders actually want as part of the process is necessary. This is where ethical practice emerges, as I mentioned earlier. And very quickly, if you're interested in learning a bit more about how we took this theoretical research about the toolkitification of AI ethics and how we turned it um, into a tool, we have a paper coming out that we will be presenting at FACT later this year. So a toolkit for compliance, a toolkit for justice, drawing on cross-sectoral expertise to develop a pro-justice EU AI Act toolkit. And I'll skip this part, but because I would like to show you the tool first, but I will say that we have, it was a challenging process trying to actually think of something useful, usable. And I will explain in a second that we co-designed the toolkit with practitioners, with AI developers. So there was a lot of negotiation process going on behind the scenes, so to speak. And we struggled in many ways, like to think about like what might it mean to, on the one hand, give this huge process of thinking about ethics some structure without making the process itself look or feel simplistic or simplified or too simplified. Um, how to give the process, how to give it justice while at the same time making it easier, indeed, for practitioners to do some of the things that we suggest should be done. In the paper, we also reflect on some challenges and also the ways in which we try to mitigate some of the issues that emerged as we were working in a cross-sectoral collaboration between a university-based team and an industry-based team. But now, without further ado, let me just very quickly introduce you to the framework. That's the most useful part of the presentation today. So the toolkit that we produced as a result of this bigger project is called HEAT, the High Risk EU AI Act Toolkit. Don't ask me why we came up with this acronym and how, like which letters made it to HEAT, but that's what it's called. As you can see here, our intended users are actually primarily project managers, in particular from small or medium enterprises. So we're not thinking our end users are not necessarily meant to be from huge companies, because many of these companies already have dedicated teams that work on complying with the AI Act. But of course, the framework that we built is usable by anyone. And indeed, because of its open access nature and it's free to use, anyone can mix and use whatever we put together as they wish if they want to customize our framework for the use of for their own company organization. As you can see here, we tried to make it interactive as well, so that's why we worked with a development team. It's not yet another PDF guideline, and I'm not sure if I mentioned, but the company that we worked with, not for, as part of this project is Accenture. So we started working with them when they were still a smaller. We started working with a smaller organization in Italy, an AI company, a provider called Ammagamma, and then in the meantime, they got acquired by Accenture. And so some of the issues that emerged when they were acquired by a bigger company with different goals, we reflect on in the paper that I mentioned a second ago. I should gesture to the team that is behind the toolkit itself. So Eleanor, Yulu, and Dorian were on the Cambridge side. Cosimo Fiorini and Virginia Vignali were on the Italian end, working for Accenture. Apart from the core team, we were also working with a pretty interdisciplinary advisory board, where we elicited feedback and drew on our advisory board members' expertise. And these people range from critical data scholars or feminist data science scholars to AI developers working for bigger companies, human AI interaction, researchers working for companies as well as some of our colleagues at Cambridge that were not directly involved in the project, but whose expertise we drew on, including, for instance, my colleague Perry McInerney, who's a specialist in AI and anti-racist methods. So heat. Okay, so very quickly, how did we structure this process? So, to give a sense of direction to the teams working with our framework, but at the same time, making clear that in many ways, the process that you're starting is circular, that you actually, it's not something you can, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a matter of ticking a box and moving on to the next stage, but many times it is something that you have to continuously rethink. We decided to design the tool through this concept of spaces. So spaces are these interconnected areas of interest that team members have to pass throughout development and deployment. So of course they start with the team, a business team and principal space. So this is sort of like a foundational space where you think about the values behind your work, where you think about responsibilities and how they're divided, who's responsible for what on your team. But then the other spaces are in many ways interconnected. So what we say is, like for instance, to conduct a meaningful impact assessment and to develop a meaningful risk mitigation strategy, you need to engage with external stakeholders. This is not something that you will be able to do fully on your own. So that's why, as you will see here, stakeholder engagement is a central space within this framework, where we actually point to this space at multiple other points in the cycle, where we invite users to go back to this space. And since it's so central, even though it's not made compulsory by the AI Act, so engaging with external stakeholders and involving marginalized, minoritized stakeholders is not a requirement that the AI Act makes, we decided to still make it so central. So maybe I could show you a bit more about show you a bit more details on this specific space. And through this, I mean, you will also hopefully get a sense of like how these spaces work. So each space is subdivided into a number of tasks, and each task then comes with a link to the AI Act, so that it's very clear to our users why we're asking them to do these things. So they don't feel like we're just overwhelming them with some new requirements while they do not really understand why they need to do these things, such as identify our stakeholders. And we also provide a rationale so that it's not only up to the user to find out what the AI Act is saying about this, but we're also providing an extra justification. And this is something that always appears for all the users whenever they go to a task. And then they can also see a description of the task, a set of more clear instructions on how to conduct the task, so the how to approach section, as well as a workbook section where they can take notes or upload notes on how they're approaching a given task, so that they can then download all this material and present it as a PDF if they wanted to prove their compliance and prove that they have been making these efforts to ensure that they comply with the AI Act. So as you can see here, we guide our users through identifying stakeholders, which many of you know is actually very difficult. We then guide them through, we then give them some guidance on how to engage with stakeholders meaningfully, which again is extremely difficult. We link them to some best practices. So for instance, a self-reflexive assessment of participatory practices is a questionnaire developed by Ammagamma, Birhane, and colleagues 2 or 3 years ago. It's a very, very good checklist. Not really a checklist, actually. Maybe I should use a different word, but like this is one of these instances where actually a list of questions that are not necessarily meant to be ticked off can be a very useful ideation and design tool. In part because this one actually does specifically mention friction. And what happens when there is friction? What happens when you engage with people who are saying, well, you know what, you shouldn't go ahead with this project. It's wrong. How do you process disagreement in a meaningful way again? And finally, we also, for many of the subtasks, we actually also include a go further section so that the users are made aware of what we consider desirable, not necessarily compulsory under the AI Act, but something that they can consider doing if they really want to move towards this pro-justice, pro-environmental sustainability side of things. So in the stakeholder engagement section, for instance, we include some information on how you can move from consultation to genuine inclusion, and then also to collaboration, where stakeholders are not just people that you consult with to understand a specific aspect of your system, but actually they become co-owners of the emerging framework design product. And maybe before I wrap up, I should just note that there are other elements. This is just an example of something that we do that is different, but you will see elements like this throughout the toolkit. And so, for instance, in the risk assessment space, there is a whole section dedicated to thinking about the environmental costs of developing an AI system. That section includes some information on more than human-centered design, so the kind of design that encourages developers to consider the environment or nature, let's say, as a stakeholder in the design process as well. So we really, surreptitiously, in some sense, we invite our users to, yes, on the one hand, think about how they can comply with this new regulation, but also think about how they can build on that regulation and the compliance mechanisms that need to emerge to do more than that, to move beyond mere compliance. If you're interested in testing the tool, this is the link. It's an awkward one, but we are working on, so this is released as a beta version, and the final version of the tool will be, actually I should say an updated version of the tool will be released in the next couple of weeks. And we have around 20 minutes, so I'll stop here because maybe there are some questions.